There's no way she's still alive, Julia whispered, her eyes locked on the storm drain in front of her, the cold rain pouring down in sheets around her. It had been hours since they started the search. The storm was getting worse by the minute, but still, they couldn't give up. Not when there was a chance that a dog, a helpless, terrified dog, was out there somewhere, needing them. But Julia had doubts. The odds were slim, and the heavy rain was only making it harder to track any scent. She wiped her wet hair from her face and peered down the alley, a dim street lamp barely illuminating the cracked pavement. Beside her, her husband, Mike, stood silent, arms folded, looking as unsure as she felt. His expression was a mixture of concern and frustration. "I think we've searched everywhere," Mike said, his voice tinged with exhaustion. "Maybe it's just too late." Julia shook her head, resolute. "No, I can't give up, I just can't." They had spent the last couple of days combing through the neighborhood after a local shelter received an anonymous tip that a stray dog had been seen in the area. The dog had been hurt, probably abandoned, and Julia couldn't shake the image of her small face, drenched and trembling, curled up in the dark corner of that drain. "This is where she was last seen," Julia continued, taking a step forward. The alley felt colder now, the shadows growing longer as the light flickered overhead. "She has to be here, I just know it." Mike hesitated, then slowly nodded. "All right, let's give it one last check." They crouched down beside the storm drain, Julia's hand instinctively reaching out for Mike's. She gave it a reassuring squeeze before slipping her fingers into the narrow grate. The rain was heavy now, pounding on the metal, but they could still hear the faint sounds of movement beneath their feet. The dog was in there. That much was certain. Mike knelt beside her, frowning. "Julia, I don't—" "Shh," she said, holding up a finger. Her heart pounded in her chest, the quiet urgency making her breath catch. For a second, it felt like the whole world had gone still, leaving only the distant sound of rushing water, the storm a relentless force against the alley's walls. Then it came again, a faint, raspy whimper. "I heard it," Julia breathed, her voice barely a whisper. Mike stiffened, his eyes narrowing as he leaned closer. The sound came from deep within the drain, a broken, fragile noise that could only belong to an animal in pain. He looked at her, his worry deepening. "Is she—" Julia didn't wait for the question to finish. Her hands were already on the drain cover, tugging with all her strength, the metal groaning in protest as she wrenched it free. A chill ran down her spine as she pulled the grate aside, revealing the narrow opening below. At first, all they could see was the black void, the drain deeper than they'd thought, shadows hiding whatever was at the bottom. But then a small paw appeared, its fur matted and soaked, the white pads caked in grime. A single, trembling paw. "Mike!" Julia's voice cracked. She could barely speak, overcome by the sight of it. That paw, it was a sign that the dog was alive. Without a second thought, Julia reached in, her fingers brushing against the cold, wet fur. "Hey, sweetheart. We're here. You're safe now." The dog didn't pull away. Instead, it seemed to be making an effort to reach out, inching its way closer, as if it knew help was near. Julia swallowed hard, her throat tightening. She felt Mike's hand on her shoulder, giving her a gentle nudge. "Let's get her out of there," he said softly, his voice filled with a new kind of hope. Working together, They carefully eased the dog from the depths of the storm drain, lifting her fragile body into their arms. She was light, too light. Her ribs were visible under the fur, the once white coat now caked in mud and dirt. Julia gently stroked her head, whispering soft words of comfort, as if the dog could understand. "It's okay, girl. We've got you. You're going to be okay," Julia murmured. The dog's eyes were wide and fearful, but there was something in them, a glimmer of trust, a flicker of hope. It was enough to make Julia's heart break and swell with gratitude all at once. As they made their way back to the car, Julia kept one hand pressed against the dog's trembling body, feeling the warmth she had so desperately been waiting for. They had found her. They had saved her. But as they reached the vehicle, she couldn't help but wonder, how long had this dog been alone? What had she been through before they found her? And what would happen now that she was safe? "Do you think she'll make it?" Mike asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Julia nodded, though her eyes were filled with uncertainty. "She has to. She's a fighter." The drive to the animal shelter was quiet, except for the sound of the dog's soft whimpering. Julia kept her hand on her, never once letting go, her heart filled with a determination that would not let her fail this fragile little creature. They arrived at the shelter within minutes, and the staff were ready for them, rushing out to take the dog from their arms. Julia stood back, watching as the technicians worked quickly to assess the dog's condition. "She's been through a lot," one of the nurses said, her face filled with concern, "but we'll do everything we can." As they led the dog inside, Julia turned to Mike, her heart heavy with a mix of emotions. There was a sense of relief, yes, but also a deep sadness. She had been through so much in her short life. How much more could she endure before she finally found peace? Mike placed a hand on her shoulder. "You did good, Julia. You saved her." Julia took a deep breath, fighting back the tears that threatened to fall. She had saved her. This was just the beginning. The little dog had a name, they were told. They hadn't known that when they found her, but now, as they sat together in the waiting room, it seemed fitting. Her name was Hope, and Hope wasn't giving up. Not now. Not ever. Hope had been through the worst, or so Julia hoped. She lay in a clean cage at the shelter, her small body wrapped in a soft blanket. The volunteers were careful as they tended to her, checking her vital signs, offering her water, and giving her soft, comforting words. But Hope wasn't yet out of the woods. Her condition remained critical. Julia's heart ached as she sat near the cage watching Hope sleep. Her tiny chest rose and fell with each shallow breath, a stark contrast to the vibrant dog Julia had hoped to find. Julia reached through the bars of the cage, letting her hand rest on Hope's paw. The little dog stirred, her ears twitching, but she didn't wake. She seemed comforted by the touch, just as Julia had been the moment she had found her in that storm drain. "I'm so sorry you had to go through this, sweet girl," Julia whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "But we're here now. You're not alone anymore." Mike walked into the room, his face tired but filled with hope. He had spent the last several hours helping the shelter with other tasks, but his thoughts never left Hope. "How's she doing?" Mike asked quietly, joining Julia by the cage. Julia looked up at him with a hopeful but sad smile. "Better, I think. They've given her fluids and some pain medication. They're going to keep monitoring her overnight." Mike knelt beside the cage, reaching in to gently scratch behind Hope's ears. "She's lucky we found her when we did." Julia's smile faltered slightly. "We're lucky we found her, Mike. I can't imagine what would have happened if we hadn't gone out tonight. She could have just been another stray, disappearing into the streets. I can't believe how close we came to losing her." Mike squeezed her hand. "But you didn't give up. That's what matters. You kept looking." Julia gave a soft laugh, wiping a stray tear from her cheek. "I couldn't stop, not with everything she'd been through. I had to believe she was out there waiting for us." Hope let out a small sigh, her body shifting slightly, and for a brief moment, her eyes fluttered open. They locked with Julia's for a split second, before the little dog drifted back into sleep. "She knows we're here," Julia murmured, her voice filled with warmth. "She knows she's safe." Later that night, after the shelter had closed for the evening, Julia and Mike were allowed to stay for a while longer. The staff told them it was all right for them to just be there for Hope. After all, the dog was still adjusting, and the comforting presence of her rescuers would help her feel safe. "I think she's going to make it, Julia," Mike said, settling into the chair beside her. Julia smiled, though it was tinged with uncertainty. "I hope so. I can't stop thinking about how she was before. All alone, stuck in that storm drain, scared." Mike put an arm around her shoulder. "She's not alone anymore. We found her, and we're not going anywhere. She's family now." Julia looked down at Hope, her heart swelling with love for the tiny creature who had been through so much. She thought of the storm drain again, the cold, damp place where Hope had hidden, hoping for a way out. It was a cruel reminder of the world they lived in, one where animals could be left behind, forgotten. But Hope was strong. Julia could see it now in the way the dog's chest rose and fell with more ease, the way she no longer trembled at the slightest sound. Hope was fighting for her life, just as Julia had fought for her. As the night wore on, Hope continued to rest peacefully, her breathing steady. Julia could feel the bond between them grow stronger with each passing minute. It wasn't just the physical act of saving her that mattered. It was the emotional connection, the promise of a better life. Julia had always known she wanted to help animals, but this was something more. This was a soul-deep commitment. By the time the shelter closed and the lights dimmed, Hope had entered a more stable state. The volunteers assured Julia that they would keep a close watch on her through the night, and that in the morning they would know more about how to proceed. But there was a glimmer of hope now, a faint light at the end of the tunnel. Julia leaned over the cage, brushing a gentle kiss to the top of Hope's head. "We're going to take good care of you. I promise." The next morning, the shelter staff confirmed that Hope had made significant progress. She was still weak, still fragile, but her vital signs were much improved. She was eating on her own, though reluctantly, and drinking water without difficulty. Julia and Mike stayed by her side throughout the day, offering food and water, slowly coaxing her to trust them. By evening, Hope was able to walk a few shaky steps, her legs wobbly but determined. The little dog still seemed unsure of her surroundings, but every time Julia or Mike spoke to her, her tail gave the faintest wag. It wasn't much, but it was enough. "She's coming around," Mike said, his voice full of pride. Julia nodded, her eyes shining. "She's a fighter." The following days were a whirlwind of visits, veterinary checkups, and careful rehabilitation. Hope was doing better with each passing hour, though it was clear she still needed time to fully recover. The shelter staff kept a close eye on her, offering the care and attention she needed. But Julia and Mike were there every step of the way, giving her the love she had so desperately missed. Hope's progress was slow but steady. She grew stronger, more confident, and slowly began to trust the humans who had taken her in. Julia would sit with her for hours, talking softly to her, letting the dog feel safe and secure in her presence. Mike would bring her treats, letting her nibble from his hand, rewarding her for each small victory. But there was still work to be done. Hope needed training, socialization, and plenty of love before she could find her forever home. Julia and Mike knew it wouldn't be easy, but they were committed. They were her family now, and as the days passed, it became clear to both of them that there was no way they could let her go. Hope had already found her place in their hearts. Hope's journey was far from over, but her life had already been changed forever, and so had theirs. Hope had started to thrive in the days following her recovery. Julia and Mike's commitment was unwavering, and the bond between them and the little dog was growing stronger every day. They continued to take turns visiting the shelter, staying by Hope's side, and providing her with comfort and care. It was a routine now. Every morning and evening they'd arrive, their hearts light with anticipation of seeing Hope's progress. Every time they walked through the shelter doors, there was something new to celebrate. A wag of the tail, a bark of excitement, a newfound curiosity as Hope began to explore her surroundings. She was no longer the scared, fragile dog they had found in the storm drain. She was transforming into something new, something full of life, love, and possibility. But despite her progress, there was still something holding Hope back. Her trust in people had begun to grow, but she still struggled with certain things. Loud noises made her flinch, and sudden movements sent her cowering into the corners of her kennel. She was hesitant to approach strangers, though she had warmed up to Julia and Mike in ways they never expected. They were her security, her safe haven, and she clung to them when Paev and they were around. "Do you think she'll ever be fully healed?" Julia asked one evening as she sat on the floor of the shelter's play area, watching Hope trot around with tentative steps. Mike leaned against the wall, watching as Hope cautiously sniffed a new toy, clearly unsure whether it was something she could trust. "I think she's already healing," he said quietly. "Not just physically, but emotionally too." Julia nodded. She had been thinking the same thing. Hope's body was strong now. Her coat had regained some of its shine, and her muscles were no longer thin and fragile. But it was her heart that needed the most care. Hope had been through so much in her short life. She had been abandoned, left to fend for herself, and then rescued from the very brink of death. The emotional scars were not as visible as the physical ones, but they were there, hidden beneath the surface. As the weeks passed, Hope's behavior slowly began to change. There were still moments when she would retreat into the shadows, overwhelmed by a sudden noise or the presence of someone new. But there were other moments when her eyes shone with the same joy she had once hidden from the world. She would play with Julia and Mike, chasing after toys or rolling on the grass with abandon. Her tail wagged furiously, her body brimming with excitement and energy. She had started to trust them, and that trust was all they needed to begin teaching her how to live again. One afternoon, as the sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden light over the shelter's yard, Julia sat with Hope in her lap, scratching behind her ears. The dog's eyes fluttered with pleasure as Julia's fingers worked their magic. Mike was a few feet away, talking with one of the shelter staff members about the next steps in Hope's rehabilitation. I think she's ready for more, Julia said to Mike, glancing up from Hope with a small smile. I know she's still scared sometimes, but she's making such good progress. I can see it in her eyes. She wants to be a normal dog again. Mike paused and then nodded. I think you're right. She's been through so much, but she's strong. We just need to keep giving her the right environment to thrive. We can do that, Julia said with confidence, her voice steady. She's already a different dog than the one we found in that storm drain. We just need to give her more time, more space, and more love. She deserves that. Mike walked over, kneeling down beside them. He reached out, offering Hope a treat, and she took it eagerly, her tail wagging. I think she's ready for the next step. What do you say we start with training tomorrow? Julia's face lit up at the idea. That sounds perfect. I've been thinking about it for a while. She's smart, Mike. She just needs to know we're here for her. We'll start slow. Basic commands, and maybe a few fun tricks. Just to build her confidence. Mike smiled. And if she doesn't get it right away, that's okay. We're in no rush. The next day, they began Hope's training. At first, it was a slow process. She was hesitant and unsure of what was expected of her. But with Julia's patience and Mike's encouragement, Hope began to catch on. Sit, stay, come. Simple commands, but they made a world of difference. Every time Hope responded correctly, she was rewarded with praise, love, and treats. Her tail would wag furiously, and her eyes would shine with pride. It was in these moments that Julia saw the true potential in Hope. She wasn't just a dog who had been rescued from a storm drain. She was a dog with a future. A bright future, filled with possibilities. And Julia and Mike were determined to give her that future. As the weeks passed, Hope continued to grow. She became more confident, more playful, and more comfortable in her own skin. The shy, fearful dog who had once cowered in the corner was now bounding across the yard with joy, her tail held high, her eyes sparkling with life. But it wasn't just the physical changes that amazed Julia. It was the emotional transformation. Hope had learned to trust again. She had learned that not all humans were cruel. Not all humans would leave her behind to fend for herself. Julia and Mike had shown her that love, kindness, and patience could heal even the deepest scars. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Julia sat with Hope on the porch of their home, watching as the dog lay contentedly at her feet. Mike was inside preparing dinner, but Julia couldn't bring herself to move. She was watching Hope, marveling at how far she had come. "You've come a long way, haven't you, girl?" Julia whispered, her voice full of affection. Hope looked up at her, her eyes soft and trusting. Julia smiled and stroked the dog's fur. "I don't think I could ever let you go." The decision had been made without either of them speaking it aloud. Julia and Mike knew without a shadow of a doubt that Hope was home. She had been through too much, and they had become too attached. She was their family now. And as Hope settled her head onto Julia's lap, sighing in contentment, Julia knew that their journey together had only just begun. It was late afternoon when Julia sat by the window, watching the rain trickle down the glass. The weather seemed to match her thoughts. A gray and overcast sky, heavy with impending change. But it wasn't the rain that had her restless. It was Hope. The little dog had made incredible progress since they brought her home. Hope was no longer the fragile creature they had first met. She was full of energy now, chasing after tennis balls, running through the backyard with abandon, and even learning a few new tricks along the way. She had become more than just a rescue. She was a part of their family, an inseparable thread in the fabric of their lives. But lately, there was something Julia couldn't shake. A feeling that Hope was still holding something back. She had come so far, yet there were moments when Julia saw that familiar wariness in her eyes, the same look she had when they first found her. She would flinch at sudden movements, shrink away from loud noises, and occasionally retreat into the shadows when things got too overwhelming. Mike had noticed it too. He had tried to reassure Julia that it was just part of Hope's healing process, that these things took time, and he was right. But that didn't stop the nagging feeling in Julia's chest. Hope had been through so much. What if there was more to her past than they had realized? What if the trauma ran deeper than they could see? Maybe I'm just overthinking it, Julia murmured to herself, rubbing her temples. It had been a long day. Work, errands, life, and her mind was racing. She needed a moment to breathe, to clear her head. Just as she stood up, the familiar sound of paws padding across the floor interrupted her thoughts. Hope trotted into the room, her tail wagging, her ears perked up. Julia smiled, reaching down to ruffle the dog's soft fur. Hope nuzzled her hand affectionately before sitting down at her feet. "You're always there when I need you, aren't you, girl?" Julia whispered, kneeling down to meet Hope's gaze. "You're so strong. You've been through so much, and yet here you are, still trusting, still loving." Hope tilted her head, as if she understood, her eyes gentle and full of affection. Julia's heart warmed at the sight. "Okay," Julia said with a sigh, standing up. "Let's go for a walk. Maybe some fresh air will help clear my head." Mike was working late that evening, so Julia took Hope on her usual walk through the neighborhood. They had developed a routine, a walk every evening, just the two of them, down quiet streets and through leafy parks. It had become their time, their special moment to bond and reflect. Tonight, however, something felt different. The air was thick with moisture, and the streets were eerily quiet. Julia glanced down at Hope, noticing how her steps had slowed, her posture tense. The little dog's head was held low, her ears flat against her skull. She seemed distracted, her nose twitching as she sniffed the air. "What is it, girl?" Julia asked softly, kneeling down to her level. "Are you okay?" Hope didn't answer, of course, but she did look up at Julia with a quiet intensity, her eyes locked on something in the distance. Julia followed her gaze, but there was nothing there. No one walking by, no car passing. Just an empty street and the dim glow of streetlights. But the air felt charged, like something was about to happen. Julia straightened up, rubbing Hope's back in a soothing motion. "Come on, let's keep going." They walked for a few more minutes, but Hope's unease seemed to grow. Her steps were hesitant now, as if she was unsure whether to keep going or turn back. Julia tried to keep the mood light, talking softly to Hope, encouraging her to move forward. "Come on, girl," Julia said. "You're safe now. We're just going for a walk. Nothing's going to happen." But the dog didn't seem reassured. Her eyes darted around, her tail tucked low, and her pace slowed even further. Julia's concern grew, but she didn't want to push Hope too hard. Maybe it was just a moment of uncertainty, something fleeting that would pass once they got further into the walk. Then, without warning, Hope froze in place, her body rigid, her gaze fixed on something across the street. Julia turned to look, but once again, there was nothing there. No movement, no sound, just the quiet of the empty road. "Hope?" Julia called softly, but the dog didn't respond. She was still staring intently at the spot across the street. her ears strained and her body stiff. Julia felt a chill run down her spine. Something about the way Hope was acting didn't sit right. It was as if the dog was sensing something she couldn't see. Slowly, Julia crouched down to Hope's level, trying to coax her out of whatever trance she had fallen into. "It's okay, girl. There's nothing there." But Hope didn't budge. Her eyes were fixed, unblinking, on the same spot, her body trembling. Julia reached out to gently touch Hope's shoulder, but the dog flinched away, her entire body jerking with fear. "What's wrong?" Julia whispered, her voice laced with concern. She didn't know what was going on, but it was clear Hope wasn't reacting like she usually did. Something was deeply unsettling her. Just as Julia was about to pull Hope closer and make their way home, the silence was broken by a faint sound in the distance. A low growl, almost imperceptible at first, but growing louder with each passing second. Julia's heart raced as she stood up and scanned the street, trying to locate the source of the noise. Her instincts were on high alert, and she could feel the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Hope's growl followed soon after, sharp and low, a warning, but her body remained still. Julia's eyes widened as she noticed the change in Hope's demeanor. The dog's usual friendly, gentle nature was gone, replaced by something more primal, more protective. "Hope, what's going on?" Julia murmured, taking a step back. She was starting to panic now. Her fingers fumbled for her phone in her pocket, her mind racing. But before she could dial for help or make sense of the situation, she saw it. A figure emerging from the shadows, a man moving steadily toward them. Julia's breath caught in her throat. The man wasn't walking exactly. It was more of a slow, deliberate glide, as if he had all the time in the world to make his way across the street. His features were obscured by the darkness, but his movements were fluid, unnatural. "Hope!" Julia cried out, her voice trembling with fear. But Hope didn't react. She was still frozen in place, her body taut with tension, her growl growing louder. The man took another step forward. The man took another step forward, and Hope's growl grew even louder, more intense. Julia's pulse quickened as the figure loomed closer, his presence sending a wave of unease through her entire body. The man's face remained hidden in the shadows, but there was something about the way he moved that set Julia's instincts on edge. It wasn't just his silence. It was the cold, unyielding nature of his approach. "Hope," Julia whispered, trying to keep her voice calm, though she could feel the rising tide of panic threatening to overtake her. "It's okay, girl. You don't need to be scared." But Hope was having none of it. The dog remained motionless, her eyes locked on the man, her body trembling. The low growl became a warning, almost a challenge, but the man didn't flinch. He simply kept walking, his gaze never once leaving Hope's intense stare. Julia backed up a step, her heart racing in her chest. She couldn't explain it, but everything in her screamed that something wasn't right. This man didn't look like a neighbor or a passerby. His presence felt off, as if he wasn't just a stranger in the night, but something more, something dangerous. "Stay," Julia said softly to Hope, her voice laced with more command than she intended. The dog's response was immediate. Her growl stopped, but she was still rigid, her body tense and ready to spring. The man finally spoke, his voice low and rasping. "You shouldn't have brought her here." Julia's stomach dropped at the sound of his voice. There was something about it that was unsettling, like it didn't quite fit with the world around them. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice shaking but firm. The man didn't answer immediately. He stopped a few feet away from them, his eyes narrowing. Julia's hand instinctively went to her phone, but she hesitated. She didn't know who this man was, or if he was dangerous. But she didn't want to risk angering him. She needed to think. She needed to get Hope out of here. "Hope," she whispered, trying to keep her composure. "Come on, girl. Let's go." Hope didn't move. Her eyes never left the man's face, and her tail was stiff, held low, a sign of both fear and readiness. Julia took a step back, trying to distance herself from the man, but her mind was racing. Was this some kind of threat? Or was there something more to Hope's reaction that she didn't understand? "You've brought her back into the world," the man said again, his voice like a warning. "She was better off where she was." Julia's confusion deepened. "What do you mean? Who are you talking about? Hope?" The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he took another step forward, his movement fluid, almost hypnotic. Hope's body grew tenser, her growl rising once more, louder this time, as if she could sense something in the man's presence that Julia couldn't. The dog's eyes flicked briefly to Julia, as though checking in, seeking reassurance. "Stay," Julia said again, more forcefully this time. But the man continued his approach, his steps deliberate, as if he was unbothered by Hope's warnings. He was almost close enough now to reach out and touch them both. Julia's breath caught in her throat as the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. This wasn't just a random encounter. There was something familiar in the way Hope reacted, something that connected the man to her past in a way Julia couldn't yet understand. "Hope," Julia said softly, her voice shaking. "What do you know about him?" At the sound of her name, Hope's growl stopped abruptly. She stood still for a long moment, her body trembling, her eyes locked on the man. Then, to Julia's surprise, the dog slowly took a step back, her posture uncertain. It was as if she recognized the man. But how? Julia was about to speak again when the man finally stepped forward, a step that brought him within arm's reach of them. "I don't want to hurt you," the man said, his voice unnervingly calm. "But you need to understand. The dog doesn't belong in your world." Julia's eyes widened. "What do you mean by that?" she demanded. "Hope belongs with us. She's part of our family now." The man smiled, but it wasn't a smile of comfort. It was a thin, unsettling curve of his lips, one that didn't reach his eyes. "You think she's just a dog? You think she's just a stray you found?" His voice became colder. "You don't understand what she is, what she's meant for." Julia stepped back, her hand tightening around her phone. She was on edge, but she refused to let fear dictate her actions. "Stay away from us," she warned, her voice trembling with both fear and determination. "You don't belong here. Just leave." The man's smile widened, but his eyes were darker now, filled with something unreadable. "You won't be able to keep her forever. She's not yours to keep." Hope's body stiffened again. This time, Julia noticed something different in the dog's eyes, something almost knowing. The way Hope looked at the man now wasn't the same as before. It was as if the dog recognized him, but in a way that Julia couldn't quite grasp. "I don't know who you are," Julia said, her voice stronger now. "But you need to leave. Hope is ours. We're her family. You don't have any claim to her." The man stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, finally, He took a step back, his eyes never leaving Hope. He didn't say another word. He just turned and walked away, disappearing into the night, his figure swallowed by the shadows. Julia stood there for a long moment, the stillness of the night pressing in on her. She could feel Hope's eyes on her, could sense the dog's unease, but the immediate threat had passed. The man was gone. Still, Julia's heart raced, her thoughts a whirlwind. What had just happened? Who was that man, and why had Hope reacted the way she did? After what felt like an eternity, Julia finally turned back to Hope, who was standing rigid, her eyes still fixed on the spot where the man had disappeared. The dog didn't move, her body tense, her tail held low. "It's okay, girl," Julia said softly, kneeling down to Hope's level. "He's gone. You're safe." But Hope didn't seem reassured. She remained still, her body taut, her gaze distant. Julia's heart ached as she reached out to gently stroke the dog's fur. Something was wrong, something deep, something that went beyond what she could see. Hope wasn't just scared. She wasn't just reacting to a stranger. There was something in the dog's past, something that had been triggered by the man's presence. Julia didn't know what it was, but she was determined to find out. She had to. "Come on, girl," Julia said softly, rising to her feet. "Let's get home. We'll figure this out together." But as they made their way back down the street, Julia couldn't shake the feeling that their peaceful life was no longer as simple as it had once been. The shadows were closing in, and Hope's past was calling, whether Julia was ready to face it or not. The walk home felt longer than usual. Julia kept her eyes on Hope, who remained unusually quiet, her posture stiff and unsettled. The events from the night weighed heavily on Julia's mind, gnawing at her thoughts. Who had that man been? Why did he say such strange things? And why did Hope react the way she did? It didn't make sense, not to Julia. As they reached their front door, Julia paused, glancing down at Hope. The dog's eyes were wide, distant, her tail tucked low. Hope didn't seem to recognize her surroundings at the moment. Her gaze was still focused on the street behind them, as if she could still murmur the presence of the man, as if he hadn't really gone. "Hey, girl," Julia said softly, bending down to meet Hope's eyes. "It's okay. We're home now. You're safe." But Hope didn't respond. The dog didn't even look up at her. She remained frozen, as if caught between two worlds. Julia's heart ached, and she placed a gentle hand on Hope's back, trying to offer comfort. But there was a deeper layer of fear within the dog that she couldn't understand. Mike was inside, just finishing up dinner, and when he heard the door open, he rushed over, concern evident in his eyes. "What happened? Are you okay?" he asked, his gaze shifting to Hope, who was still frozen in place. Julia shook her head, her voice shaky. "Something's wrong, Mike. That man, he said some strange things. And Hope, she reacted like she knew him, like she was scared of him. I don't know what to make of it." Mike frowned, glancing between Julia and Hope. "Do you think it's from her past? That maybe there's something we don't know about her before we found her?" Julia sighed deeply, her fingers brushing Hope's fur. "I don't know, but it's like she recognized him. There was something in her eyes, something that said she knew him, and it wasn't good." Mike crouched down beside Hope, his expression filled with concern. He gently placed a hand on her head, but Hope flinched slightly, her body still tense, her eyes darting toward the door as if waiting for the man to return. "We'll figure it out," Mike said, his voice reassuring but tinged with uncertainty. "We'll get to the bottom of this, Julia." But Julia didn't feel reassured. She had never seen hope like this before. So distant, so filled with fear. The bond they had built over the past few weeks felt fragile in the face of whatever had haunted Hope before. There was something deep in the dog's past that Julia couldn't reach, something that had been triggered by that encounter, and she didn't know if she was ready to face it. The evening passed quietly, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. Hope eventually settled down on her bed in the corner of the living room, but her eyes remained open, her body still. She didn't move, didn't interact, didn't even react when Mike called her name. It was as though she had shut down, retreating into herself. Julia couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the brink of something they weren't prepared for. Whatever was in Hope's past, it was surfacing now. The question was, what had happened to her before she found her way into Julia's life? Who was that man, and what was his connection to Hope? Later that night, after Mike had gone to bed, Julia sat up, unable to sleep. She found herself staring at Hope, who had finally curled up on her bed, but was still tense, her eyes half closed but still alert. There was a restlessness in her posture, as if she were waiting for something or someone to come. Julia's mind raced with questions. She couldn't ignore the nagging suspicion that the man had been more than just a stranger. There was a reason Hope had reacted the way she did. She had been through so much already. How much more could she bear? The thought was unbearable. She needed answers. She needed to know what was hidden in Hope's past. She needed to understand what kind of life Hope had lived before she had come to them. The next day, Julia decided to take matters into her own hands. She would do whatever it took to uncover Hope's past, no matter how painful it might be. She owed it to the dog, to herself, and to Mike. They couldn't move forward, not until they understood what Hope had been through. That afternoon, Julia went to the shelter. She needed to talk to the staff, to see if anyone knew anything about Hope's history before she had been found abandoned. The shelter was quiet, and the staff were busy with their usual duties. But when Julia mentioned Hope's name, the receptionist's face changed. "You're looking for her history, aren't you?" the woman asked, her voice soft but filled with understanding. Julia nodded. "Yes, I need to know what happened to her before we found her. I think it's important." The receptionist paused, glancing around the room as if making sure no one else was listening. She leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "We don't know much about her past. She came to us as a stray, and her condition was pretty bad. She'd been out there for a while, alone and scared." "But is there anything else?" Julia pressed. "Anything that might explain why she's so afraid of certain things? Or why she reacted the way she did when that man showed up?" The receptionist hesitated before speaking again. "There's one thing. When she first came in, we noticed she had a collar on. A very worn, very old collar. It had a tag, but it wasn't like a normal tag. It was a strange shape, like a symbol, not a name or number. We tried to trace it, but the tag was too worn to make out any details. It could have been someone's, or it could have been a symbol of some kind. We weren't sure." Julia's heart skipped a beat. A symbol. That was strange. It was more than just a collar. It was a clue, a sign that there was more to Hope's past than anyone had realized. "Do you still have the collar?" Julia asked, her voice urgent. The receptionist nodded. "Yes, I believe it's still in storage." I can get it for you, but you'll have to wait a bit. Julia didn't hesitate. Please get it for me. The receptionist gave her a nod and left the room to retrieve the collar. Julia's mind raced with the possibilities. A symbol? What did it mean? Was it connected to the man who had appeared the night before? Was Hope's past more complicated than anyone had imagined? When the receptionist returned with the collar, Julia took it in her hands, her breath catching as she examined the worn leather and faded metal tag. The symbol etched into the metal was unfamiliar, but it was unmistakable. A twisted, abstract shape that looked almost like a combination of circles and jagged lines. It was unlike any tag Julia had ever seen before. "Do you know what this means?" Julia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The receptionist shook her head. "I've never seen anything like it. We tried to look it up, but it didn't match anything we found. It's possible it's some kind of insignia, but it's not one we recognize." Julia's heart pounded as she traced the symbol with her fingers. There was something about it, something that felt important, something that connected Hope to a world she didn't understand. This wasn't just a stray dog. This wasn't just a rescue. There was a story here, a story that Julia had to uncover. "I'll keep looking into it," Julia said softly, determination filling her voice. "Thank you for this." As she left the shelter, Julia couldn't shake the feeling that Hope's past was a mystery that needed to be solved. And no matter how long it took, she was going to find the answers. Julia's hands shook as she held the collar, the strange symbol still imprinted in her mind. The receptionist had said it was unlike anything she had seen before, and Julia couldn't help but feel that the more she looked at it, the more it felt like a clue. Something hidden in plain sight that she needed to uncover. She left the shelter with the collar in her bag, her mind reeling with questions. What did this symbol mean? Who had given it to Hope? And why had Hope reacted the way she did when that man appeared? The drive home felt long, every passing second filled with anticipation. She barely registered the streets she drove through, her mind focused solely on Hope and the mystery that had begun to unfold. As she pulled into the driveway, she sat for a moment, staring at the collar in her bag, trying to piece together the puzzle. There had to be a connection. There had to be a reason Hope was so afraid. Why that man knew something about her past. When Julia entered the house, Hope was in her usual spot by the door, her eyes bright but still a little distant. She stood up as Julia walked in, her tail wagging cautiously, her ears perked up as though she sensed the change in Julia's demeanor. The moment Julia locked eyes with her, something in Hope's gaze shifted. Her eyes flickered briefly to the collar in Julia's hand before looking away again. "Hey, girl," Julia whispered, kneeling down to greet her. Hope immediately trotted over, nuzzling her hand. But there was something different in her behavior, something that told Julia the dog was still on edge. "We're going to figure this out, okay?" Mike was in the kitchen preparing dinner as usual, but when he heard Julia's footsteps, he came out to meet her. He noticed the serious look on her face immediately. "What's wrong?" he asked, setting down the knife he had been using to chop vegetables. "I went back to the shelter," Julia said, her voice steady but filled with urgency. "I found something that might explain Hope's past." Mike raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" Julia pulled the collar from her bag, showing him the worn leather and the strange symbol engraved on the metal tag. This symbol was on the collar Hope was wearing when she was found. The staff said it's something they've never seen before. "I think it's important, Mike." Mike examined the collar, his expression deepening as he traced the symbol with his fingers. "What do you think it means?" "I don't know yet," Julia said, her voice filled with frustration. "But I'm going to find out. I have to. I need to know what's in Hope's past, why she reacted the way she did with that man last night. There's something I'm missing, Mike. Something big." Mike nodded slowly, understanding the weight of her words. "I know, Julia. I can see it too. Something's been haunting Hope, and whatever it is, it's affecting all of us." Julia sighed, her eyes still on the collar. "I don't know if I'm ready for the truth, Mike. I'm scared of what we might find." "I know," Mike said, stepping closer and placing a hand on her shoulder. "But we'll do it together. We'll figure it out." Julia nodded, grateful for his support. "I don't want to force Hope into something she's not ready for. I just want to understand." Later that evening, after they had eaten dinner and Hope had settled down in her bed, Julia sat at the kitchen table, the collar in front of her. She searched the internet for anything related to the symbol, typing in various combinations of words and descriptions. She found nothing. There were no results, no clues, no leads. It was as if the symbol had never existed. Her frustration mounted as the hours passed, the quiet of the house settling in around her. Hope lay curled up in the corner of the living room, her eyes half closed but still alert. Julia couldn't shake the feeling that the dog knew more than she let on. It was as if Hope was guarding a secret, something too painful to remember, too terrifying to face. By midnight, Julia had exhausted every resource she could think of. She sat back in her chair, staring at the screen, her mind a blur of confusion. What now? Where else could she look? The symbol wasn't from any known organization, and there were no other clues to go on. The silence of the house felt overwhelming, and the weight of the mystery pressed down on her chest. That's when the idea hit her. What if there was someone who knew something about this symbol? Someone who had seen it before? She remembered a conversation she had overheard at the shelter a few days ago. The staff had mentioned an old man who volunteered at the shelter sometimes, someone who had been around for years and who had a deep knowledge of animals. They had said he was a little eccentric, but he seemed to know things about the dogs that no one else did. Maybe he knew something about the symbol. Maybe he could help her. The next morning, Julia went back to the shelter, determined to find the man. She arrived early, hoping he would be there. When she stepped inside, the staff greeted her, but they seemed busy with their morning tasks. Julia approached the front desk, where the receptionist from the other day was working. "I'm looking for the man who volunteers here," Julia said. "He's older, and I think he's been around for a long time. I overheard you talking about him a few days ago. Do you know where he is?" The receptionist smiled knowingly. "You must be talking about Charlie. He comes in every morning to help with the animals. He's usually in the back, cleaning the kennels. I can take you to him." Julia thanked her and followed the receptionist through the shelter. She was led to a small room in the back, where an older man was sweeping the floor. His hair was thin and white, and his face was weathered with age, but his eyes were sharp, full of intelligence and experience. He looked up when Julia entered, and a warm smile spread across his face. "Charlie?" Julia asked hesitantly. "That's me," he replied, setting down the broom. "What can I do for you, miss?" "I was hoping you could help me with something," Julia said, pulling out the collar and showing it to him. "Do you recognize this symbol?" Charlie's eyes narrowed slightly as he studied the collar. He took it in his hands, his fingers brushing over the worn leather. For a long moment, He didn't speak. Julia's heart pounded as she waited for his reaction. Was this the break she had been looking for? Finally, Charlie spoke, his voice quiet but certain. "I've seen this symbol before," he said. "Not often, but I've seen it." Julia's breath caught in her throat. "Where? What does it mean?" Charlie hesitated for a moment, his eyes flicking to the collar again. "It's not a symbol that's easy to talk about. It belongs to a group, one that doesn't take kindly to outsiders, especially when they start poking around." Julia's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? Who are they?" Charlie glanced around, as if making sure no one was listening, before he leaned in closer. "They call themselves the Wardens. They're a sort of underground network. They take care of certain animals, ones with special abilities, ones like your dog." Julia felt a chill run down her spine. "Special abilities?" Charlie nodded. "Yes, Hope isn't just a regular dog. She's part of something bigger, and the Wardens are very protective of their animals. Very secretive. If they know she's with you, they won't stop looking until they get her back." Julia stood frozen, the weight of his words sinking in. Hope wasn't just a stray dog. She wasn't just a rescue. She was something much more. The truth was more terrifying than she had ever imagined. Julia stood motionless, her mind reeling as she processed Charlie's words. The Wardens? An underground network? The reality of it all was sinking in, too quickly for her to grasp. The calm, loving dog she had taken in, the dog she thought she had rescued from the streets, was somehow tied to a secretive organization, an organization that would stop at nothing to reclaim her. Hope wasn't just a stray. She was part of something much bigger, and Julia had unknowingly become part of that something too. Charlie looked at her, his expression both weary and understanding. "You need to understand, miss. The Wardens aren't a group to take lightly. They don't just protect their animals, they control them. They have their own methods of training, of controlling behavior, and if they've got a dog like Hope, they'll go to any lengths to get her back." Julia's heart raced, and for a moment, she felt like the ground beneath her was slipping away. But why would they be after Hope? She's just a dog. She's not some kind of weapon, right? Charlie's face softened, though his eyes were filled with something darker. "It's not about what you think, miss. Hope might look like just a dog to you. But she's different. They've trained her for something specific. She's not like the others. That collar, it's a mark of something they've done to her, something that makes her valuable." Julia swallowed hard, trying to process the enormity of what she was hearing. "What did they do to her?" she whispered, barely able to keep her voice steady. "What kind of things? What is she supposed to be?" Charlie's gaze lingered on the collar, and his voice dropped even lower. "I don't know everything, but I know enough. Hope. She's been bred for something they call the project. It's something experimental, something involving the abilities of certain animals. They can do things to them, train them, enhance them, and Hope, she's part of that." Julia's mind spun as she tried to make sense of Charlie's cryptic words. What did he mean by enhanced? What kind of abilities was he talking about? The Hope she knew didn't seem anything but ordinary. Just a sweet, loyal dog who had been through hell and back. But if Charlie was right, if what he was saying was true, then the Hope she had come to love and protect was far more than she could have ever imagined. Is there any way to stop them? Julia asked, her voice trembling. Can we protect her? Keep her safe? Charlie gave a slow, sorrowful nod. Maybe, but it won't be easy. The wardens aren't just going to let go of their assets. And once they realize she's been taken, once they find out she's with you, they'll come for her. You won't be able to hide from them. Julia felt her chest tighten as her thoughts raced. She couldn't lose hope. She couldn't let her go back to whatever life the wardens had planned for her. The dog was part of their family now. She was part of her family. But how could she keep Hope safe from something so dangerous, so powerful? How could she protect a dog from an organization that had its own secretive agenda, that had trained her for who knew what purpose? Charlie watched her struggle, his face hardening as he spoke again. Listen, miss. If you want to keep Hope safe, you need to move quickly. You can't stay here. You need to leave town, go somewhere they won't be able to send you. Julia's head snapped up. Leave town? But you don't have a choice, Charlie said urgently. They'll be looking for her. They'll know she's been taken, and they'll track you down. The longer you stay here, the more dangerous it gets. You have to get out now, before it's too late. Julia stood there, her hands trembling as she clutched the collar tightly in her grasp. The thought of leaving everything behind, her home, her life, everything she had worked for, felt impossible. But what choice did she have? Hope was in danger. The dog was part of something she didn't understand, something that Julia was now involved in whether she liked it or not. Where do I go? Julia whispered. How do I escape them? Charlie's eyes softened, though the grimness never left his face. You need to find someone who can help you, someone who knows the wardens, someone who can protect you and Hope. But it won't be easy. The wardens don't let their secrets slip. You'll have to be careful. Julia felt a cold pit form in her stomach. Who can help me? Who knows about them? Charlie didn't answer immediately. He looked around the room, as if considering how much he should say. Finally, he leaned in close. There's a man, he said quietly. He's known to be an ally to people who've crossed paths with the wardens. He's a former member. He can help you, but you'll have to find him on your own. His name is Elias. He's hiding, but he's your best chance. Where can I find him? Julia asked, her voice urgent. Charlie hesitated. I don't know exactly where he is now, but I can tell you this. He's made contact with people in places like New York, Chicago, maybe even farther. He's good at staying hidden. If you find him, he'll help you protect Hope. Julia nodded, her mind already racing with plans. I'll find him. I'll do whatever it takes. Charlie watched her with a mixture of sadness and respect. Be careful, miss. The wardens are powerful. You can't trust anyone you meet along the way. If they know you're after Elias, they'll come after you. They're good at finding people who are trying to hide. Julia nodded again, her determination setting in like a stone in her chest. She had to do this, for Hope, for the family she had started to build. Charlie gave her one last look. I'm sorry I couldn't help more, he said, but you're on your own now. With that, he turned and left the room, leaving Julia standing there, the weight of the situation pressing down on her like a heavy fog. She had no choice but to go forward, to find Elias, to protect Hope. She left the shelter with a new resolve, but her heart was heavy with the knowledge of what lay ahead. The wardens were a force to be reckoned with, and they weren't going to stop looking for Hope. She had to act quickly, before it was too late. Back at home, Mike was waiting for her, his expression anxious. What did he say? What did you find out? Julia swallowed hard, trying to steady her breath. We need to leave. Now. Mike's eyes widened. What do you mean? Leave? What's going on, Julia? They're coming for Hope, she said, her voice filled with certainty. The wardens. They've been looking for her. We can't stay here anymore. Mike's face went pale. The wardens? Who are they? They're the ones who've trained Hope, Julia explained, her voice shaking. She's part of something bigger, something dangerous. Mike took a step back, as if processing the gravity of the situation. So, what do we do? We leave, Julia said firmly. We go find Elias. He's the only one who can help us. Mike nodded slowly, his fear evident but tempered by his trust in Julia. Let's go then. We don't have any time to waste. With no time to lose, they packed their things quickly, Hope included, and set off into the unknown, unsure of where the road would lead them. But one thing was certain. The wardens were coming, and they would stop at nothing to take Hope back. The car was packed and ready, but Julia couldn't shake the weight of what she had just done. She had left everything behind. Her home, her work, the life she had built, everything. But it didn't matter anymore. The only thing that mattered was keeping Hope safe, and if that meant running, then running was what they would do. Mike was at the wheel, his eyes focused on the road ahead, but Julia could feel the tension in the air. It wasn't just the danger of the wardens that had her on edge. It was the uncertainty of the journey ahead. They were heading into the unknown, without any clear direction. They had no idea where Elias was, no idea what they were walking into, but they knew they couldn't stay where they were. Hope lay quietly in the back seat, her eyes staring out the window, her body still tense. It had been hours since they left, and yet the dog hadn't relaxed. She seemed to sense that they were being hunted, even without fully understanding the magnitude of the danger. It was heartbreaking to see her like this, so alert, so afraid, yet still trusting. Still holding on to the hope that Julia and Mike would protect her. Where do we go from here? Mike asked, breaking the silence as he glanced at Julia. Julia stared out the window, her mind racing. Elias, she said quietly. We find him. He's our only hope. Mike nodded but didn't speak. He understood. They both did. Elias was their only chance, the only person who might know how to stop the wardens from finding them. As the hours passed, the scenery outside the car window changed from the familiar streets of their town to open highways and unfamiliar landscapes. Julia's thoughts were clouded with worry. Every passing car, every movement in the distance felt like a threat. The wardens could be anywhere. They could be watching. She had no idea how they would track her and Mike, but she knew they would. And the idea that Elias might be the only one who could help didn't offer much comfort. The further they drove, the more Julia began to wonder just how much of this was true. What had Hope really been through? What had she been a part of? And why was she so important to the wardens? She couldn't imagine her sweet, gentle dog being anything other than what she was now, a survivor, a creature who had been through hell and somehow come out the other side. Yet, the deeper they dug, the more questions emerged, questions Julia didn't have the answers to. As the sun began to set, they reached a small town. Julia didn't recognize the name on the signs, but that didn't matter. It wasn't the place that mattered. It was the mission. They needed to find Elias, and they needed to do it quickly. Mike pulled off the highway and into a small motel parking lot. The place looked run down, and Julia was immediately suspicious. It didn't feel right. But they had to stay somewhere, and they had to stay under the radar. "Let's grab a room," Mike suggested. "We'll rest and figure out our next move." Julia nodded, but there was no rest in her mind. She couldn't relax. Not yet. Not until they found Elias and figured out how to keep Hope safe. The motel clerk gave them a strange look when they checked in. Julia couldn't help but wonder if they were already being watched. The clerk didn't ask many questions, but there was something in the way he watched them, something that made Julia's skin crawl. They went to their room, a small, dimly lit place that smelled faintly of mildew. The door had a lock, but no chain, and the windows were barely sealed. Julia felt exposed, like she was living in a house of cards that could collapse at any moment. But she didn't let herself dwell on it. Not yet. She sat down on the bed, her mind still racing. "Mike," she said softly, looking over at him, "we have to be careful. We don't know who might be watching us." Mike nodded, his expression serious. "I know. We'll be fine. We just need to keep moving forward." Hope padded over to Julia and sat down beside her, leaning against her side. Julia reached down and scratched behind the dog's ears, her heart aching as she looked into Hope's eyes. There was a sadness there, a fear that Julia couldn't quite fix. The dog had already been through so much, and now she was being dragged into this new, terrifying world. But Hope trusted her. She trusted Julia and Mike, and that was all they could rely on. The night passed slowly, each minute feeling like an eternity. They didn't dare fall asleep fully, always keeping one ear open for any sound outside the door or window. But nothing happened. No one came. No one knocked. The next morning, they set out again, driving through back roads and small towns. Julia had spent the night researching Elias, trying to find any lead, any hint that might tell her where he could be. But the more she searched, the more she realized that Elias was like a ghost. No one knew exactly where he was. No one had ever seen him in person. It wasn't until late afternoon that they found their first real lead. They stopped at a small gas station on the outskirts of town, and Julia went inside to pay. When she returned, she saw Mike talking to an older man outside. The man was tall, with a scruffy beard, and he had a worn leather jacket that looked out of place in the warm weather. He was speaking to Mike in low tones, and as soon as he saw Julia approaching, he turned his gaze toward her. His eyes were sharp, calculating, and Julia's heart skipped a beat. "This is Elias," Mike said, his voice calm but filled with surprise. Julia's breath caught in her throat. This was it. This was the man who could help them. But what kind of help could he offer, and at what cost? Elias stepped forward, offering his hand. "I've heard a lot about you," he said, his voice low and steady. "I've been waiting for you." Julia hesitated for only a moment before taking his hand. "You know about us?" "I know more than you think," Elias said, his eyes studying her carefully. "And I know about Hope. She's not just a dog, is she?" "No," Julia said, her voice barely a whisper. She's been through so much. The wardens, they want her back." Elias nodded, his expression unreadable. "They won't stop until they get her. You need to be ready for them. They won't stop hunting." "Will you help us?" Mike asked. Elias gave a slow, deliberate nod. "I will, but it won't be easy. The wardens are everywhere, and they're not afraid to get their hands dirty. Julia felt a chill run down her spine. She knew this wasn't going to be easy, but they had no choice now. They couldn't go back. Hope's future depended on what Elias could offer. "I'll do whatever it takes," Julia said, her voice filled with determination. Elias looked at Hope, who was sitting quietly beside them, watching him with wary eyes. "We need to get her out of here. Somewhere they can't track her. Somewhere they can't find her." Julia nodded. "Where do we go?" Elias didn't hesitate. "We go underground. It's the only way." And with that, the journey into the unknown began. The road ahead was dark, but for the first time in weeks, Julia felt a flicker of hope. They weren't alone anymore. They had Elias, and together they would fight for Hope's future.